So I'm going to start with a quote from David Kennard, who happens to be here. I've added a little bit to it. If beyond Fuchs and Maine, and my little addition is and Bridger, had created a feast of new ideas at Northfield, it was Jones that sat down and produced a recipe that others could follow. And really that's at the back of what I'll be talking about. Today we'll be sampling some of the feast, some of the fare at the feast, and I'm here to introduce the hors d'oeuvres, but I do hope I don't give you indigestion. I had planned to give you three basic areas I want to give a message about, really. One is that Northfield reframed the doctor-patient relationship in this country. Second, it introduced the social into psychiatry. And third, that we have a lot of learning to do from Harold Bridger. I don't know if people know the song Lonesome and Very Quarrelsome Heroes, but in fact it fits rather well. I shall read out Leonard Cohen's first bit of this. A bunch of lonesome and very quarrelsome heroes were smoking out along the open road. The night was very dark and thick between them, each man beneath his ordinary load. I'd like to tell my story, said one of them, so young and bold. I'd like to tell my story before I turn into gold. These were patients at Northfield. I happen to know the son of one of them. I won't tell you which one. And I think we've talked about Olympians. I do think we've got to think about the heroes that were going through Northfield. At the back you'll see a bit more about some of the heroes that were there. They were winning MCs, VCs. They were men of remarkable artistic talent there as well. I did want to bring them to the forefront of what I've got to say. Okay, I'll trace a few threads of the complex weave that made up Northfield experiments and how they've influenced therapeutic communities subsequently. I'm only too aware of the gaps in my knowledge, some of which will be fulfilled by my colleagues who are going to follow on. I also contend that more possibilities were posed than have been subsequently delivered, and in particular I'll be referring to Harold Bridger, whose model of open and closed systems I think has been overlooked in this country in particular. I have now to admit to a prejudice. My particular sympathies at this time during the war lie with the Tavistock group of workers. This is largely because their recognition of the task of Northfield was actually a very minor part of the psychiatric psychology input they had into the British Army during the whole war. At other times they were engaged in activities such as recruitment, officer training, military training, morale, resettlement of prisoners of war, and the broader issues of psychiatry in the army. This rather contrasts with Fuchs and Beer and many others who were at Northfield, for whom doing therapy was the primary task. Reading Fuchs's papers, it's evident that he, along with many other psychiatrists, saw the war as a rather inconvenient interruption to his study of group therapy. Indeed, he was observed by two of his colleagues to open a session of therapy, stating, "I want you to look upon me as you would the doctor in a white coat, and not someone in uniform." The arguments between these 2 points at Northfield were very heated. Ronald Markilly, who was another doctor there, recalled the relationships were racked with personal conflicts and rivalries of intensely well-meaning psychiatrists and psychotherapists. As an example, Tom Main, in a letter to John Rickman, described Fuchs as a cult leader with his disciples and asked whether Christ was as phony as he seemed. He expanded on this theme some 40 years later when I interviewed him. They wanted to go on treating these people, but it was inappropriate in the time of war. They wanted to pursue this selfish interest of theirs when there was bloody great issues to be resolved. Sounds very Tom Main for anybody who knew him. There is an issue about the TAVI, which is that undoubtedly the Tavistock group were not easily understood by their colleagues. Charles Lewson, who was the medic at Northfield, knew Bion and Rickman, and he found that his colleagues, the other psychiatrists at Northfield, found them rather insular and arrogant towards other doctors. They could even be rather opaque to each other. Jock Sutherland recalled how he and John Rickman were not entirely on Bion's wavelength in a trial study group, and Eric Trist was completely at sea in an early psychotherapy group that Bion conducted. So even the Tavistock group themselves weren't always in tune. I haven't got time to run through everything that happened at Northfield. I'm afraid you'll either have to stay in ignorance or read my book. But I will outline some salient points about psychiatric practice at the hospital before embarking on the participants' further influence post-war. It's first of all important to recognise, this is Northfield Hospital in the First World War. It's important to recognise that the Northfield was a military hospital. This is Sergeant Gaskin, sergeant in charge of discipline. Wonderful man, I met him and enjoyed the and in front of him is the commanding officer at the time of the Northfield experiment, the second Northfield experiments. But they're all in uniform. They are members of the army. The patients were in a special uniform, the blues, but they were also subject to military discipline. This is the cover of a book written by Rainer Heppenstall, the copy of which is up at the front there, at the back there. Military discipline was obligatory. Perhaps not always carried out as rigorously as it might be elsewhere, but it was a military hospital. The task was to re-engage as many possible of the soldiers in useful work in the British Army. This did not mean involving them going back to the battlefront. All psychiatrists joining the army had to recognise that their preoccupation was not with the needs of the individual, but time and military training needs are pressing. It's also important to recognise that the second experiments were not carried out in an entirely uncomprehending or hostile environment. Group work was actively encouraged by senior officers within the British Army, and the lessons learned were applied to the civilian resettlement units that offered rehabilitation to thousands of returning prisoners of war. 84 British psychiatrists in uniform. I like to show this picture to my patients sometimes. Bion stated, the task of the military psychiatrist is to produce self-respecting men, socially adjusted to the community, and therefore willing to accept its responsibilities, whether in peace or war. I want to emphasise the socially adjusted, and that's part of my background of what I'm going to be talking about. The army is a group enterprise. Each unit relies on the ability of those in it to work with each other, particularly in conditions of stress. The use of groups was not merely a means of treating people economically, but an active process enabling the soldiers to gain transferable skills in working together and gaining the self-respect that goes with this. The emphasis was on what the soldiers themselves could do to help themselves and each other and gain insight into their interactions. Typical of these enterprises was the organising of a welcoming committee of more experienced patients to introduce new arrivals to the hospital. This resulted in an introductory pamphlet produced by the patients themselves. I will now turn to the actors at Northfield and their subsequent influence. I'm only going to be referring to British adult therapeutic communities, and part of the emphasis will be around the Ingerborn Centre, which is the therapeutic community I'm at present researching, trained to be a real doctor, not just a Bachelor of Medicine. I'm hopefully, my colleagues Bob, Dieter and Diana will expand on more group analytic ideas. At the heart of the experiment was a shift in relationships between those receiving treatment and those offering it. Tom Main, in particular, emphasised the move from patients being treated like the passive children of the psychiatrist, obedient in nursery-like activities, to being active participants in creating the milieu in which they were living, with sincere adult roles to play. John Rickman, echoed by Fuchs, emphasised the sense of ownership that this entails when he described how the soldiers referred to the ward as our ward. Bridger explained that the individual can only experience full freedom and satisfaction in a society that recognises his worth and gives him the opportunity to develop in a spirit of warm human relationships. To enable this, he instructed his staff not to continue training men in particular skills, but to watch for and respond to initiatives that they themselves came up with. In order to effect this, the staff had to be equally open and understand the processes. As Bridger described how at Northfield, the therapeutic task now involved far greater interdisciplinary practice of all kinds. Their traditional roles of looking after the sick had to evolve into one that jointly enabled patients to take the initiative. Bridger, Rickman and Beon all worked in the War Office selection boards, where they formed multidisciplinary teams with psychologists and regular army officers of different ranks. I think this probably is the earliest I know of multidisciplinary teams in British psychiatry. And obviously therapeutic communities took this up fairly quickly, but British General Adult Psychiatry has still, in many cases, some way to go. Another significant outcome of the Northfield experiment was the importance of leading a group by not doing so. Beon, Rickman, and I understand Fuchs certainly at Exeter, although at Northfield the evidence is a bit ambivalent, allowed the group to develop in silence, without introductions by the group leader. Rickman had group experience at Quaker meetings that acted both as a precedent and experience in taking this approach. Beon himself would have been aware of this practice through his friendship with a Quaker in World War I and through Rickman himself. The second fundamental development by Beon and Rickman was the study of here and now interactions and relationships between the group members rather than focusing on psychohistorical issues. Bridger distinguished between this and Fuchs's approach, in which the individual could be observed and reflected upon by others. It was a setting for this to happen rather than being a dynamic life of its own. Now I have to remind you, this is Bridger talking about Fuchs in Northfield, not perhaps subsequently. Peer group discussions between psychiatrists on how groups operated were also novel. Sorry, my Theresa May moment. These were held on a weekly basis for nearly a year, and were an opportunity for all the doctors to openly discuss the dilemmas they were experiencing in running groups. We have a record in the Wellcome Institute of all these groups taken verbatim, which are probably some of the most exciting bits of material that comes out of Northfield. Rank gave way to experience in group psychotherapy. Moving on to after the war, it appears that the development of adult therapeutic communities in the 1950s and 60s occurred with little reference to the Northfield experiments. Maxwell Jones famously never mentioned them, although he privately acknowledged the debt. Dennis Martin at Claybury refers equally to Maxwell Jones and the Northfield experiments and discussions he had with a wide variety of people. And this is probably how the word spread at the time, through the various psychiatrists meeting at the college and meeting at different meetings. The actual papers from Northfield, I'm not sure, being published in the Meningin Clinic, they were terribly open to the general adult psychiatrists in this country. With the early development of therapeutic communities, the protagonists were aware of each other and met during conferences, but largely went their own way, developing their work on an ad hoc basis. Dave Clark at Woolbourne, while mentioning Fuchs's book and the papers by Beon, refers to Maxwell Jones as being one of the most significant figures during this period. In his autobiography, however, there's a real sense of him feeling his way, and it's actually one of his junior doctors who initiated the first TC on the ward in 1958. And Clark recalled conversations with Maxwell Jones and his visit to Belmont. And there isn't a reference to Northfield at all. The sense of making it up as they went along is reflected in many of the stories and papers written in the early development of adult therapeutic communities. The full recognition of the work of Northfield experiments was probably more a consequence of the pioneers reflecting back on the achievements and giving weight to the papers they'd authored already. I certainly never knew of the Menninger Clinic papers until I went to the Maudsley, and I suddenly discovered them. At the Ingerborn Centre, Richard Crockett was in contact with his friend Jock Sutherland, a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist and leader of the Tavistock Clinic, who knew Bridger and Rickman well. Crockett was, however, a little uncertain what the latter was trying to tell him. His diary records in 1954, "Today, had an interesting talk with JDS. He tends to be a bit diffuse." He appears to have taken some notice of the concept of intergroup tensions when speaking on the practice in 1959, but this is an afterthought secondary to his acknowledgement of Maxwell Jones, from whom he took a great deal of fundamental philosophy. This lack of recognition in Northfield is not surprising. Only Tom Main stayed in the field and wrote a few articles, most notably The Ailment, which he presented at the medical psychology section of the Royal Society of Medicine in 1957. Richard Crockett emphasised that this paper drove his argument for openness and communication in the Ingerborn Centre. Maxwell Jones and Sigmund Fuchs, on the other hand, were clearly more adept at publicising their approaches. Fuchs produced his account of Northfield experiments in 1948. In the introduction to group analytic therapy, his colleagues from the Tavistock played very minor roles in his account, and indeed Tom Main gets as many mentions as that well-known psychotherapist Admiral Lord Nelson. His later group psychotherapy, however, significantly influenced Dr. Blaise Maloney, who was particularly significant at Northfield in developing the real therapeutic community approach. In parallel, Fuchs set up the Group Analytic Society, which was supported by weekly seminars, but most important impetus was perhaps the founding of the Institute of Group Analysis, which developed a formal training in group therapy. At Ingerborn, this training became a central training plank. Anybody who wished to be a group therapist was encouraged to train at the IGA. And this included the nurses and an art therapist who went on to write a book on art therapy and group analysis. I understand that the Henderson similarly the IGA was important. However, a person I do want to bring up is Harold Bridger. He was influential more in Europe than perhaps in this country. In 1984, speaking at the Conference of Italian Therapeutic Communities, he explored the issues arising from maintaining open systems in the face of an increasingly complex and intrusive external environment. Do we recognise this? He reframed the therapeutic community as a transitional space-time experience derived from Winnicott's conception of the transitional object. It was an open system which has to find a balance between maintaining an existing state, culture and structure, while endeavouring to be creative in fulfilling its purpose, growth and development. Here the participants had to both reflect on the practical task confronting them and the emotional unconscious process that hindered them in doing it, in tackling it. He unravels the spurious opposition of democracy and hierarchy. The former is a way of life, whilst the latter is a structural issue. The opposite of democracy is not hierarchy, but authoritarianism. Or ignoring hierarchy results in confusion and the failure to address the necessary responsibilities incumbent on running such an organisation. The ensuing conflict tends to be seen as a clash of personalities rather than seeing it as stemming from the underlying structural problems. In my opinion, this failure to address the importance of leadership in running a countercultural organisation in a fluctuating and increasingly hostile environment is a continuing problem in British therapeutic community thinking. The movement continues to rely on exceptional people taking such roles without acknowledging the complexities and responsibilities of the task. Bridger offers an alternative viewpoint from which to examine the opportunities the TC provides for reflection and testing that the participants experience as they struggle with the internal and external tensions that are exposed. He argues that open systems are more appropriate in the present changing world. In presenting the foregoing, I've skated over a whole raft of issues. Due to constraints of time, both the complex and multi-stranded range of the thinking that occurred at Northfield has been oversimplified. However, I hope I've been able to give a glimpse of the creativity and influence of those working at the hospital, which my colleagues will be standing for. I just wanted to reiterate the three things I wanted: reframing the relationships, emphasis on the social aspects, and bridge around transitional space, and to remember the people who actually were there.